Bonjour à tous. C'est avec
Hello,
beaucoup
everyone.
d'honneur et de plaisir
It is a great
que
honor and
je
a
vous souhaite la
pleasure
bienvenue à ce
for
webinaire
me to
consacré
welcome
à
you
un
to this
thème
webinar
assez original
devoted
qui
to a
concerne
quite
la
an
régulation
original
des prix
topic.
et la
So,
mobilisation
price
des ressources
regulation
internes dans les
and
pays développés.
mobilization of
Plus
domestic
généralement, régler
resources
ensemble
in
des politiques
developing
budgétaires
countries. These are two
et celles-ci
dimensions
coordonnées.
of which are usually
Dans
treated
un contexte
separately.
marqué
In a
aujourd'hui par la
context which
multiplication
today
des
is
récentes
marked by
crises
the
dans notre région,
multiplication of
que
international
ce soit
crises,
sanitaire,
health
financière,
crises,
climatique ou
financial
géopolitique,
crises, climatic and geopolitical
la stabilité
crises,
des prix,
price stability,
qui se traduit généralement dans beaucoup de
which
pays en développement par une
generally
régulation
translates
de
in
ces prix,
developing countries
est
into price
redevenu une enjeu
regulation, has
central. Cependant,
once
la
again
pression
become a
inflationniste
central issue. However,
fragilise la
inflationary
soutenabilité
pressures
budgétaire
are
de ces
undermining the budgetary
politiques.
sustainability of
En
these
même temps,
policies.
la mobilisation des
And
recettes
at the same
internes, et
time,
notamment les
domestic
recettes
revenue
fiscales,
mobilization,
est un axe,
especially tax
sinon l'axe
mobilization,
principal du
has
développement
become the main
économique
thrust of
durable,
sustainable
en
economic
particulier depuis la
development,
troisième conférence
particularly
internationale
since
sur le
the
financement
third
du
International
développement
Conference on
qui a
Financing
tenu de
for
2015 à
Development, which
Addis
was held
Abeba.
in 2015 in
Avec
Addis
la
Abeba.
prochaine, à l'approche de la
And
prochaine, la
then in the
quatrième
run up
conférence
to the fourth
internationale qui
conference,
se tiendra cette année
which
à
this year
Séville,
will be held
il
in
nous était fort
Seville,
apparu intéressant
we thought it would be interesting
d'analyser la
to
question
combine
de
these,
l'interaction entre les
these two
dépenses, entre les
dimensions of
dépenses, entre les questions
fiscal
de régulation des
policy,
prix et
price
les obligations
regulation, and
intérieures.
domestic resource
Ces
mobilization.
questions
Although
sont
these
intéressantes
issues are
non seulement
generally
séparément, mais également
looked
dans
at
leur interaction.
separately,
Je
there
me
are
réjouis
many
donc
interactions
que
between the
ce
two. I
webinaire
am delighted that our
réunisse des
webinar
acteurs africains,
has brought
des
together people
représentants
from Africa,
du Congo
representatives
en
from
la personne
Congo,
de Monsieur Antoine Kodia,
with Mr.
qui est
Antoine
économiste auprès du
Nkodia, who
ministre des
is
Finances,
economic advisor to
de
the
Monsieur
Minister of
Sikassas
Finance, Mr.
Esdras,
Sikasa
directeur de la
Esdras,
législation
who is director
au
of
ministère des Finances
legislation
du
at the
Tchad.
Ministry of Finance
Nous
in
aurons
the
également
Republic
un
of Chad.
représentant
We will
en
also have
France,
a
Monsieur Audas
representative,
Koubuana
so
de
Mr.
la direction
Obwas
Oxfam Afrique,
Kubimwana from
ainsi que
Oxfam
Mario Mansour,
International, and Mario
le
Mansour,
chef de
who is
division
division
politique
chief
fiscale du
on
département
tax
des finances
policy at
publiques
the Fiscal Affairs
du Fonds
Department
monétaire
of the
international,
International
et de
Monetary
Delphine Pradi,
Fund, and
économiste
Delphine
principale
Pradi, who
à
is
la
senior
division
economist
des dépenses
and
publiques
expenditure
du même Fonds
policy
monétaire
at the
international.
Public Finance
Je vais
Department of
laisser la
the
parole
IMF. And
à
I will
Clarisse
now
SENAYA,
give the floor
qui est la
to
chef de
Clarisse
bureau exécutif pour le
SENAYA, who
développement
is
de la
head of the
Direction
Official
générale du
Development
Trésor,
Assistance
pour
Unit,
introduire
the
ce
Treasury
webinaire.
Directorate General in
Clarisse, la
France.
parole est à toi.
Clarisse, you have the floor.
Bonjour à tous,
Good
j'espère que vous
morning.
m'entendez bien.
Hello, everyone. I
Alors
hope you can hear
merci
me.
Grégoire et
Thank
merci à la
you,
Ferdi pour
Grégoire,
l'invitation
and thank you
à
to
introduire ce
Ferdi
webinaire sur une thématique
to have invited me
cruciale
for
et
introducing
tout
to this crucial
particulièrement en cette
webinar,
semaine où se tient
especially
le
in this week.
Financing for
We
Development
will have
Forum
the
à New
Financing for
York en
Development
amont
Forum
de
in New York
FFD4
ahead
comme
of
l'a
the
mentionné Grégoire.
FFD4, as Grégoire
Donc, dans ce
said.
contexte et plus
In
largement
this
d'ailleurs,
context,
je souhaite
and
souligner
more
la
broadly,
forte mobilisation
I
de
would
la
like to
France
emphasize
et
the
de la
strong
Direction
commitment
générale
of
du
France
Trésor
and the
pour
French
soutenir
Treasury
le développement économique des
for
pays en
supporting the
développement.
economic
Et
development
d'ailleurs,
of
le
developing
Conseil présidentiel
countries.
pour les
And the
partenariats
Presidential Council
internationaux qui
for
s'est tenu
International
le 4 avril
Partnerships,
dernier
which was held on
a
the 4th of
rappelé
April
l'importance pour
last,
la France
reiterated the
des
importance for
partenariats
France
internationaux
of solid
solides,
international
avec
partnerships
notamment l'objectif de contribuer à la
with the aim
stabilité
of
des pays
contributing
les
to
plus vulnérables.
stability in the most
Et de
vulnerable
notre point de vue, à
countries.
la Direction
From
générale
our
du Trésor,
viewpoint at the
cette
French Treasury,
stabilité est
this stability
nécessairement
is
macroéconomique et
necessarily
budgétaire. Et c'est
macroeconomic
à ce titre
and
que j'évoquerai
financial.
dans cette
And
introduction plus
in my
précisément notre
introduction,
soutien
I
à
would
la
like to focus on
mobilisation
our
des
support for
ressources
the
intérieures du
mobilization of
public.
domestic public
En effet,
resources.
la
Because
collecte
as
des
we know,
recettes fiscales et non
collecting
fiscales,
tax and
comme nous le
non-tax
savons tous
revenues,
ici, à la
as we
base du
all know very
fonctionnement de
well
tout
here, is
État
the
et donc
basis for
de
the functioning of
l'établissement
any
des
state,
politiques publiques
and therefore for the
propices au
establishment of
développement.
public
Dès
policies
lors,
conducive to
il apparaît
development.
essentiel de
It is therefore
renforcer
essential to
la
strengthen
mobilisation
the
des ressources
mobilization
publiques
of
au
public
niveau national,
resources
mais
at national
aussi
level
d'optimiser la
and
gestion des
to
dépenses publiques.
optimize management
On va en
of
parler plus
public
précisément
expenditure,
au
and we
cours
will be
du
saying
webinaire.
more about this during
Je
our
souhaiterais aussi
webinar.
dire que
I would
cette
also like to
question, elle est
say
encore
that
plus forte quand on
this is a
regarde
question which takes on
l'écart
even more
entre le
importance when
montant
you look at
des
the
flux d'aide
gap
publique au
between the
développement
amount
et
of
le
official
montant
development
des besoins de
assistance flows
financement pour
and the amount of
atteindre les
funding
objectifs de
required by
développement
states
durable.
to meet their
Je vais y
sustainable
revenir plus
development goals.
précisément avec quelques
And I will
chiffres dans
come
quelques
back with a
secondes.
few
Ce que
figures
je
in just a
souhaiterais
few
dire aussi, pour
seconds.
faire le
I
lien
would also
avec
like to say, to
la
link this
précédente
to
conférence sur
the
the previous
le funding for development in 2015. Starting in 2015, France decided to commit and adopted an interministerial strategy and a strategic investment plan for development aimed at financing technical assistance to increase the mobilization of domestic public resources, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. This financing is translated as a concrete implementation through a bilateral level by the Agence Française de Développement and Expertise France, as well as at a multilateral level by the IMF, as well as the World Bank. And then for FFD4, which will be held in just a few weeks, just a few months in Seville, mobilizing public domestic resources is paramount and is the first priority action in the final draft, which is under discussion currently. So to go back to the figures, according to the IMF studies, as well as studies carried out by the UN, to reach the SDGs, it's estimated that developing countries need $4 trillion a year against a global backdrop of falling official development assistance. You no doubt followed the OECD's presentation on the 16th of April on their preliminary ODA data and 2024 flows. Well, the OECD reports, even though these are just preliminary data, that ODA from the Development Assistance Committee countries stood at $212 billion, down for the first time, down by 7.1%. And this is the first time in 5 years that there has been such a large drop. Projections for 2025 suggest that this downward trend in official development assistance will certainly continue and even intensify. So in this context, only a combination of financing sources can meet needs. To do so, to mobilize more domestic resources, reforms to be implemented by governments are essential to better optimize public spending. And so that is the goal of our webinar. So, and then on the theme of subsidies, and thanks for the interventions of representatives that Grégoire mentioned from Congo, Chad, the IMF, and civil society through Oxfam, it will be, we believe, particularly interesting and useful to understand the reasons why some reforms work, others much less so, through illustrations and examples of good practice, and then to discuss whether in some cases subsidies should be maintained, how to manage a transition, and then to identify recommendations for reforms to be implemented. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that the debates will be enriching and will provide support for the ongoing reflections of all those involved in the theme of domestic resource mobilization. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Senaya.
Thank you very much, Madame Senaya, and I will now give the floor to Mr. 𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐭𝐨𝐫, and I forgot to say that this webinar is in French and English, and you can choose the language of your interpretation to switch between languages. Mr. 𝐭𝐵𝐚𝐴, you have the floor. Thank you, Grégoire.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Odas 𝐭𝐵𝐚𝐴 from Oxfam in Africa. And I want to start by thanking Ferdi for involving Oxfam, especially Oxfam Africa, in this very timely conversation on price regulation and domestic resource mobilization. It's really a timely conversation, especially when we all see worldwide the challenge that countries are having to finance, especially development, but also social projects. Therefore, in the current context, for example, where Africa is really facing a lot of challenges, especially when we look at the exploding inequality, the rising debt burden. We also see regressive tax systems across the continent. And we see also international financial systems that are not fair. We see worsening climate change impacts across the continent. We see growing conflict in a number of countries. And the rolling back of democracy in a number of countries. So all that makes this conversation quite timely, especially when we talk about less than 5 years to the end of SDGs. We cannot agree that we are quite off track. But Oxfam, as far as Oxfam is concerned, we are much more concerned about the widening inequality, especially on the continent. And a few figures will show that, for example, Africa's 6 richest men, they own more wealth than half of the continent population combined. Meanwhile, with social poverty remaining deeply entrenched, and if current trends continue, it will take Africa nearly 3 centuries to eradicate extreme poverty at $2.15 a day. I'm talking about this because this inequality that is deepening is also aggravated by a number of policies, starting from the tax, the fiscal policies that we have on the continent. For example, when we talk about subsidies, when we talk about price regulation, it is most of the time policies that are much more in favor of the already fortune, the wealth people, and not necessarily in favor of the poor. And therefore, most of those policies, we have seen them contributing to further deepening inequality. We say that the only way we can tackle inequality on the continent is if we come up with targeted measures, especially when it comes to subsidies, for example, that we come up with targeted initiatives that will tackle, will target the less fortunate. For example, we've seen in a number of cases cash transfers really working quite well because they target exactly those who are the most needy, while other subsidies measures, they end up mostly benefiting those that are already well off. We'll come back to that hopefully in the details. When for example, when you look at the number of cash transfer programs, we see, for example, in South Africa, we see in Kenya, we have seen also in Ethiopia, a number of cash transfer programs that have really lifted the poor from poverty and have helped to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. And we believe those are, for example, the one that should be prioritized when it comes to tax expenditures. These vital social protection systems, they have to be sustainable, and for that to happen, we would have to invest. When it comes to taxation and resource mobilization, we would have to invest in what we call wealth taxation. And you will agree with me that Africa is one of the regions where wealth is not taxed. Wealth is under-taxed. And there is really room for African countries to further increase local resource mobilization through proper and adequate wealth taxation. And I hope we'll have enough time to come back to that. I just wanted to say those words because I think they are very critical as we start this conversation, to state it in that context of a continent that is struggling with a number of challenges and where there is the highest level of inequality, but with quite a good room for tackling some of those challenges through adequate adequate waste taxation that would really take proper and people-centered fiscal reforms across the continent. So with those few remarks, I want to wish all of us a very fruitful webinar. Thank you.
Merci, merci, Monsieur 𝐶𝐫𝐚𝐭𝐨𝐫.
Thank you very much, Mr. 𝐶𝐫𝐚𝐭𝐨𝐫. And I will now give the floor to the representative of Congo and Chad. We will begin with Mr. Antoine Nkodia, who is the economic advisor to the Minister of Finance. Thank you very much for this invitation. I will speak much more about national realities to take stock of price regulation and subsidy policies in Congo. I will begin by saying that the economy in Congo depends very broadly on hydrofuels. So the price regulation for fuel and subsidies are a very important part of the economic and social policy of the government. A few figures to illustrate this. Fuel income represents more than half of all of the budget, 51%, 57% in 2023, and 58% in 2022. Fiscal spending went from 1.4% of GDP in 2015 to 6.4% of GDP in 2023, before coming back to 3.6% of GDP in 2024. And lastly, with an estimated cost of 4.5% of GDP in 2022 and 2.5% of GDP in 2023, full subsidies exceed public spending on health, which are 2.3% of GDP, and are comparable to spending on education at 3.6% of GDP. So in this context, and as in the financial and economic program that the Congo agreed with the IMF, the government has undertaken, starting in 2022, vast reforms to free up fuel prices with a gradual elimination of subsidies and public enterprises, both upstream and downstream. So, gas and diesel prices were increased by 5% in December 2022, and then by 25% in July 2023 for unleaded gas, super gas, and then diesel prices were increased by 25% in November 2023.
Nationale et le fuel, en fait, là, c'est pour les avions, donc de 30%. Le prix du jet international a, quant à lui, été...
International jet price has also been liberalized. Jet fuel for planes. So, taking into account this increase in fuel prices, a number of measures have been implemented to support other sectors, transport sector, for example, and households who may face secondary effects of these price increases. And so in order to face the increase in food prices, we have to note that these price increases have been decided upon after an assessment study an impact assessment study requested by the government. The fall in international oil prices in 2023 and successive increases in fuel prices have helped to contain the cost of subsidies. However, this cost remains high and restricts budgetary space for financing other sectors, while exposing the budget to significant volatility in international oil prices. So at this stage, I will stop and I will continue my presentation a little bit later. Thank you very
Merci,
much.
Monsieur 𝐭𝐿𝐴NKONDA.
Thank you, Mr.
Je vais
Nkonda.
passer la parole maintenant au directeur de la
Mr.
législation.
Nkodia. And now I will give the floor to the Director of Legislation, Litigation
Monsieur
and
Esdras.
International Tax Relations at the Ministry of Finance, Budget and
Bonjour à
Public
tout le monde.
Accounts for the Republic of Chad, Mr. Esdras. Thank you very much for inviting me
Comme l'a bien décrit le collègue du Congo, il
to
faut
take part
qu'on ressorte un peu les éléments du contexte pour le
in
Tchad.
this
Pour
webinar,
rappeler que
and I would like to also
le Tchad et le Congo se trouvent
tell
dans
you a
la
little
même
bit
situation,
about
deux
our
producteurs
context,
exportateurs de pétrole.
Chad and Congo
Donc,
being in
déjà
a similar
auparavant,
situation,
à partir de 2015,
oil exporters. And so since
avec le contexte
2015,
international de chute de barils de pétrole, les finances
in
publiques ont
with the
subi
fall
très forte
in oil
instabilité,
prices, we
ce
have
qui a
had
amené le
to
gouvernement à
face
engager
high
des réformes très
volatility, and so our
importantes.
government undertook a number of
Parce qu'entre-temps aussi
reforms
sur le plan fiscal, le taux de pression
because
fiscale étant
in the
très faible,
meantime,
à tel point
tax
qu'en 2015,
pressure
nous
being
étions
very low in
au-dessus de 200%
2015,
de taux de pression
we
fiscale, ce qui
have
explique que le niveau de
faced
prélèvement fiscal était très faible.
low
Donc le gouvernement a
tax
pris des décisions
revenues,
pour, en quelque sorte, mobiliser davantage les
low
ressources hors
tax
pétrole.
level being
Et c'est à ce moment-là, il faut
collected,
se rendre
and
compte que
the
comme
Chad
le budget
government
d'État étant
at the
largement
time,
dépendant des
we know
recettes
because our
pétrolières, il fallait
budget depends
diversifier d'abord
heavily
l'économie,
on oil revenue. We had
l'activité.
to diversify
Deuxièmement, il faut
our
maximiser les
economy
recettes hors
and
pétrole et être capable
maximize other revenue
de remplir le gap
other than oil
causé
in
par
order
la
to
chute
fill this
du
gap
baril. Donc, à ce moment-là, il y a
caused by
plusieurs
the
mesures de politique
drop
fiscale qui ont été
in
prises.
oil
D'abord,
prices. A number of tax
sur le
measures
plan
have been
politique fiscal,
implemented,
il y a des mesures de soutien à l'économie
a number
dans
of
le domaine de l'industrie et
support
du
measures to
secteur
support
privé
our
pour
industry
permettre
and
un peu
private
une
sector,
explosion du secteur privé qui puisse
to
porter un peu la croissance.
support the
Deuxièmement, au niveau
private
la
sector
politique de l'administration
and
fiscale,
growth. So
avec le
that
soutien du
was
FMI
a number
depuis
of policies
2017,
with the support of the IMF since
il y a eu
2018.
deux plans de soutien du FMI
Two plans
de
have been
2019 à
implemented with the support of the IMF in 2019-2022 plan and a 2022-2025 plan. These plans have supported the broadening of the tax base objective, have helped in increasing tax mobilization and in a number of niche sectors. And so we have worked on these tax expenditure, worked on different taxes, VAT, extractive sector, transformation sector, communication, technology, digitalization sectors. So the different measures implemented, you can see on my slide, there are a number of questions around tax expenditure reduction. With the fall of oil prices, the government had to implement a number of measures to support different sectors. And so the government decided upon different sectors, but of course the most important one being the extractive sector, working in oil and mine industries. And the government's rationale was to also support other sectors supporting growth. The second main area, as you have seen on our slide, was to support the most vulnerable, the most disadvantaged households, or, for example, by supporting NGOs, religious organizations, cultural, educative sector. And also in the agropastoral sector, you know that we have a great potential in Chad, a lot of farming, a lot of livestock. So to support our population in these initiatives, the government has supported this sector through a number of measures. Also the energy sector, because we know that the level of market penetration is very low in Chad in renewable energy, and so the government aims to support the sector to achieve a more acceptable energy coverage, and also the water sector, tourism sector, and transport, as I already mentioned. I listed here the eligible sectors. In terms of tax system, there are a number of taxes. The main tax, VAT, a structural tax, and so improving VAT could lead to improvement in tax expenditure, VAT being the lion's share in the number of exemptions, and some of the measures. I will give more details about that later on in my presentation. And corporate tax being a direct tax also is something that can be adjusted. And when we talk about TA, it is the tax minimum tax rate or applicable tax rate for apprenticeships, etc. And there are other levies the government can adjust to support investment. So since the government realized the concerns around tax advantages, we have now reached a level around 7% of GDP in tax expenditure measured. And I will also present later on the measures implemented in 2022, and then we adopted a new approach. It was important at the time to implement a number of measures, and our tax administration since 2016 has issued and decided to adopt after the adoption of a decree, they decided to streamline tax expenditure in order to better mobilize public resources, because you will see in Chad, any ministry can actually decide to implement certain measures, whether it is the ministry in charge of transport, of mining. They can decide to apply exemptions or derogatory measures without consulting the Ministry of Finance. So we have a dedicated contact person in each ministry. And as we mentioned earlier, there would be the exclusion of certain taxes, VAT, withholding taxes. And so in order to agree to this tax expenditure, there needs to be justification of investment projects and job creation. And we used to give exemption certificates, but in order to renew them, the company needs to prove that they have applied the list of specifications that have quantified these measures. So there is now specific mechanism to renew exemption certificates. They need to prove that this service is eligible. It is now a new requirement to be able to quantify, monitor exemptions and revenues. In terms of assessment, I wanted to highlight the new plan 2016-2022, and the next slide will present the results of these evaluations. The 2020 tax here, for example, we have taken a sample here of 22 documents showing mostly the tax expenditure measures. And so out of these 22, we see 14 oil and mining companies, and the assessment has not taken place yet, because these companies work over several years. It could be 20, 25 years sometimes. And so to look into these tax years, we need the relevant documents. So that is why we have been able to assess mostly industrial companies. So we see VAT, for example, representing 56% in tax expenditure, large part. And so the objective for the government is to reduce this amount. In 2021, you also can see that the oil and mining companies have not been assessed because of the work over several years. In 2021, VAT represented 63%, so an increase compared to 2020. And in 2022, certain companies having left Chad, we do not have many left, 5 of them, as you can see on this slide. And agreements have been still in place, and VAT represented 74% of tax expenditures. So the government is working on and implementing a number of measures to reduce tax expenditure to give an increased revenue. And so the goals, by way of conclusion, are diversification of the economy and support for the industrial and energy sector. Following the fall in oil prices, we want to support households and vulnerable groups, supporting purchasing power, supporting efforts to promote rationalization, the evaluation measures until 2022, the measures we have seen between 2020 2022. Actually, for the oil sector, we have a new list of requirements for these evaluation to be able to adapt this evaluation and be able to clearly identify VAT losses in this area. The World Bank has also is also supporting Chad to achieve and have access to a new evaluation framework for 2023-2024 financial years. And we're working on a draft framework for evaluating tax expenditures in the extractive sector. So this was a presentation of how we aim to broaden the tax base through our work through the IMF and the work done to rationalize tax expenditure to improve tax mobilization altogether. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Merci, Monsieur Esdras.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Esdras. So we have heard about direct expenditure subsidies for the oil sector, the oil industry, and indirect support measures. We have heard from Congo and the Chad, and I will turn now to the IMF. We will listen to Mario Monso, where we will hear about the different conditions that would make a tax reform efficient, etc. Mario Monso, you have the floor.
Merci, Grégoire.
Thank you.
Bonjour à tous. Toujours un plaisir.
Thank you, Grégoire. Good afternoon.
De faire partie des événements de la
It
Ferdi.
is always a pleasure to take part in Ferdi events, especially on this very important, significant topic. We have heard estimates on the cost of subsidies, energy subsidies. We hear less about food products subsidies or subsidies for pensions. So we have, I would say, a number of scattered figures, but I can say direct explicit subsidies represent 1.5% of GDP, according to our assessments. And if we take into account implicit subsidies, that is prices below a price related to the environment, this is multiplied
du sujet.
many times, and so we have to
Les montants sont pas la
look
seule
in
chose qui est
this
importante
topic.
dans ce
The
sujet.
general
Il y a aussi
level and
le
amounts
nombre et les
are
effets
one
sur
aspect, but we also
la
need to look
croissance
at the
économique.
number and effect on
Donc, souvent, les
economic
subventions
growth,
ont
because
bien sûr
often
des effets directs sur les prix à
subsidies
la
will have
consommation,
direct effects on consumer
mais il y a aussi
prices,
des effets sur
but there
les
are
inputs,
also
les décisions de production
impacts
qui des faits sont
on
un peu moins
policies and production
compris, je crois, ou bien
decisions.
moins
And
étudiés
these
sur ce
figures
sujet.
are less understood, I would say. There are fewer
Juste pour vous
studies
donner
on
quelques
these
exemples,
effects. And just to give you a few illustrations,
quand les produits subventionnés
when
servent comme un input,
subsidized
surtout
products
quand on
are
parle de produits
used
énergétiques ou de
as
produits
input, for example, in
d'alimentation de base,
energy-related products
c'est
or
toute la
basic
chaîne de
food
production
product,
qui est
then it will
quasiment
impact the
toutes les
whole
consommations
production
ménagères
chain.
qui est affectée. Et donc les décisions de
And
production,
in the
de
end, the
technologie,
households. So
des
production decisions
incitations
related to
d'innovation,
productions,
d'expenditure et
technologies, or
sont aussi affectés. Et
incentives
ça a
in
évidemment des conséquences à la croissance. Ces coûts sont
tools
pas
being
toujours
used, for
reflétés
certain
dans
tools
les
being used, will all
dans les
impact
décisions
growth.
que
And
les
these
Européens
impacts and effects are not always assessed, are not always taken into account
sur les
in
biens subventionnés.
impact assessments.
L'autre complexité qu'on a
Another level of complexity,
qu'on explique rarement,
which
c'est aussi
is
l'interaction
rarely
avec le reste de la
explained,
fiscalité.
is how it interacts
Donc,
with
par exemple, quand
with
on a un
taxation
produit
as a whole.
subventionné, comme disons la
When we
farine,
have a subsidized product, for example, let's
l'interaction avec
take
le reste de la
flour.
fiscalité, c'est quasiment
What is the
totale.
link
Donc,
with all of taxation? There is a
les
link with
coûts
all
des
aspects of
produits pour, par
taxation,
exemple,
because
l'impôt sur les
the cost
bénéfices
of products,
est
if we
affecté.
take, for
C'est
example,
expliqué avec
wealth
cela parce qu'on
tax,
estime
profit tax,
le
is
coût pour la
impacted.
déduction de l'input avec une formule différente des coûts
Do we need to take
pour
into
la
account
produit
these
subventionné.
input
Donc, ça crée
costs?
énormément de
Do we need
complexité
to take into account the
directe pour l'autonomie
subsidized
fiscale dans sa
cost, the
globalité.
subsidized
Il y a
product?
aussi le traitement de la
It
TVA ou
adds
des accises
a level of complexity because
qui peut jouer.
VAT,
Donc, ça crée des
excess
complexités
duties can also play a role in these calculations and in this impact. So it
dans sa
has an
globalité.
impact on the whole of the taxation system.
Quel autre? Donc, il faut, ce que j'essaie de dire, c'est que pour comprendre
What I
un
am
peu les
trying to
conditions
explain
de
here is
réforme
that
ou des
to
conséquences des
understand
subventions, il
the
faut faire
conditions around
il faut exprimer aux
reforms or
citoyens ce que ça veut
consequences
dire,
of
en
the use
fait,
of subsidies, we have to also communicate clearly, explain to citizens what does it mean when
Si
certain
je passe
products are
après
subsidized.
rapidement pour cette première intervention sur
And so moving on to
plutôt la
a different
perception des
aspect
subventions.
of my
Donc,
presentation is
souvent, ce qu'on
how
observe,
subsidies are
et
perceived
il y a le
and
chapitre
understood.
2
This is part of
moniteur
Chapter
budgétaire du
2
FMI
of
qui vient de
the
sortir
Budget
il y a,
Monitor
je crois, 2
published by
semaines,
the IMF
qui
2
contient une analyse
weeks
très,
ago.
très intéressante de ces
It
fonctions.
includes a very
Donc, souvent, ce qu'on
interesting
observe, c'est que
assessment
le
of
coût
feelings of perceptions around these subsidies. And
des
what we
subventions,
observe
donc
is
si on
that
enlève une subvention,
the
les coûts
cost
pour la
of
population
subsidies,
sont
what would be the cost for
toujours
people if we remove a subsidy?
perçus comme étant visibles,
This
même
approach
si en fait les
is
prix ne s'ajustent pas
perceived
totalement par le retrait de la subvention.
fairly negatively, even if
Ce
the
coût-là est très
prices
visible
are
et
not
il a une
impacted.
certaine,
They
comment
are
je dirais,
visible. They have
un
high
sentiment
visibility,
négatif
so
à
are
éliminer les subventions.
perceived
Parce que
fairly
ces
negatively
bénéfices
when
sont peu
subsidies
diffus et donc
are removed, but
lorsque les
benefits
bénéfices
are
vont
only
augmenter une
noticed,
fois que
perceived over
les
time.
subventions
And
éliminées en
because
fait prennent
these
leur effet
benefits
total dans la chaîne de production et de
are
consommation.
perceived later on,
Donc
once
cette
this
asymétrie
impact
dans
on
le
the
temps, ce gap en
production
fait, crée
chain
énormément de
is noticed.
difficultés
So
pour les
this gap
gouvernements.
between implementation and perception creates challenges
Comment
for
traiter avec
governments.
ces difficultés? C'est justement
So, how
en
do you tackle these
expliquant
difficulties?
qu'est-ce qui va
Well,
arriver entre
by
le moment
explaining
de
what will happen
l'élimination des
when
subventions
you do away
et
with the subsidies
comment les
and
bénéfices
when the benefits will
vont
start
être réalisés
becoming
dans le
visible
temps. Donc,
over
cette
time.
étude,
And this
le
study,
chapitre 2, en
so
fait,
chapter 2,
ce qui est un peu intéressant, c'est que même si
What's
on,
interesting
même
about
si le
it
coût est
is
un
even
facteur
if
commun, même
the
s'il y a énormément
cost
de choses que
is
l'on
shared by
observe
both, and even though a lot of
qui
things
sont
can be
communes à
observed
travers
which
les
are
pays, la
shared
solution
from one
est
country to the
spécifique au
next,
pays. Il n'y a
each
pas
solution is
vraiment
specific
de,
to a given
comment je
country. There
dirais, de
isn't really
règles
any
d'or
one
qui disent
size fits all
voilà comment éliminer
to
les
know
subventions.
how to do away
Et
with
je
subsidies.
crois qu'on va parler un petit peu
And
d'exemples tout à l'heure. Et est-ce que ces
we'll give some
exemples-là montrent
examples
que
later.
effectivement, en fait,
And these examples do
des
show that
pays gèrent l'élimination des subventions de
countries
façon
go about
très
eliminating
différente
subsidies
selon
in their
leurs
own way,
conditions macroéconomiques,
depending on
conditions
macroeconomic
sociales,
context,
l'existence ou non de crises
social and economic context, if there are any
qui posent
crises,
vraiment des conditions nécessaires et
which also
difficiles
create
pour
necessary but
éliminer ou au
difficult
moins réduire
conditions
des
for
subventions.
eliminating or reducing subsidies.
Et j'en passe à d'autres exemples aussi.
And
Donc,
there are many other
Grégoire,
examples.
je vais m'arrêter pour
So,
l'instant
Grégoire, I will
à
stop here
ces commentaires
with
très
these
généraux.
very
Et
general
on parlera
comments,
peut-être
and
des
perhaps
choses
later on
spécifiques un
we
peu
will
plus
talk
tard.
about more specific
Merci.
questions.
C'était très clair. Merci Mario.
Thank you. Very
Je vais
clear.
passer la
Thank you,
parole à
Mario. I will
Delphine,
now give the floor to Delphine,
aussi du FMI, même
also
côté
from the
dépenses
IMF,
maintenant.
but on the
Merci
side of
beaucoup.
expenditures.
Normalement,
Thank you very much.
la présentation courte va
I hope
s'afficher.
you can see my
Merci
slides.
Maëlys, vous
A
pouvez
very
passer
short
directement à la
presentation.
deuxième slide. Donc je vais répéter. Merci beaucoup
So,
d'abord pour
thank
cette
you very
invitation.
much, first of
Je
all,
pense
for
que c'est vraiment
inviting
très
me.
très utile
It's
d'avoir
extremely
les deux
useful
faces d'une même pièce, dépenses
to see both
et
sides of a
recettes,
coin, expenditures
qui s'expriment un peu en même temps
and
et qui
revenues.
sont incarnés très
It's
très
important to have them
fortement par
both and
le
strongly
contrôle de
incarnated
prix
by
de
the
certaines
price
soit
control
denrées, soit bien
of
ce qu'on appelle
some
première
goods.
nécessité. Vraiment, le contrôle des prix, c'est une
And
même pièce et
price
c'est parce qu'on a des
regulation
objectifs
is really the other
politique de
side of the
dépense
coin, because there's
et
also
les
a policy
représentants
for
de la
expenditure.
République
We
du
have the
Congo
two
et du Tchad
representatives
sont
of
venus
Congo
en
and
disant
Chad
nous
have
avons
come
des
saying that,
objectifs
okay,
soit
we
de
have
politique industrielle,
objectives
soit de
either for
politique sociale
industrial policy or
et nous
social
trouvons les
policies,
façons de les mettre en
and we
œuvre
find
et ces
ways
façons de
to
les mettre en
implement
œuvre
them.
au
And these ways
Congo,
that we
nous
find
avons
in the
parlé
Congo,
des subventions aux
well,
produits
through
pétroliers, au
subsidies
Tchad et c'était un
to
certain nombre
petroleum
d'exemptions
products, in Chad
sur la
through
fiscalité. Mais c'est
tax
finalement des
exemptions.
instruments au
But
service
these
d'une
are
politique de dépense.
instruments in
Donc il n'est pas
service of
question ici
the
de remettre en
expenditure
cause la
policy.
légitimité.
And these are
Comme ça,
legitimate.
on a aussi discuté avec
They're not under
Oxfam de la
question here.
légitimité de la
And we've
lutte
also talked
contre
with
les
Oxfam,
inégalités
the
ou de la lutte
legitimacy of
contre la
fighting
pauvreté
against
et du
inequality
service
or fighting
aux plus
against
vulnérables.
poverty in the
Je vais passer
service of
très
the
vite
most
sur cette slide
vulnerable.
parce que
So
finalement,
we'll go very
Mario
quickly through
Mansour
this
l'a déjà
through this
mentionné
slide,
et
because
ça me
Mario
rassure
Mansour mentioned most of these
vous pouvez revenir
elements.
quand même, Maëlys.
But please
Ça
come
me
back.
rassure quand même
Yeah.
qu'on
And I'm
ait le même
reassured to know
message. Donc
that our
effectivement,
messages are quite
une
similar.
estimation de la subvention, du coût budgétaire de la
So
subvention au carburant
assessing the
s'élève
cost
à
of fuel
1,5% du
subsidies,
PIB
so
dans
it's
les
1.5% of
économies émergentes.
GDP
Ça peut
across
paraître
emerging economies.
pas
This may
grand-chose au
seem
regard des
quite
dépenses de
small,
retraite dans des pays
given the
avancés.
costs of
Mais enfin,
retirement, for example, in
1,5%
developed
du PIB,
countries,
je
but
remets aussi
1.5% of GDP
dans le contexte
in
des pays
the
émergents,
context of
c'est en
emerging
général beaucoup
countries.
plus
This is
que
generally
toute
much more
l'assistance sociale
than
réunie,
all
qui a
social spending
beaucoup de mal
together.
à atteindre un seul point de PIB
They're having a lot of
dans
trouble
la
even
plupart
reaching
des économies émergentes.
1% of GDP in
C'est
emerging
en
economies.
général au moins
And generally,
la
it's
moitié, si ce n'est
at least
plus,
half
des
or
dépenses
even more
liées à l'éducation.
of
Donc comme
spending
quoi,
linked
on est
to
quand même
education.
sur la consommation
So
finale de carburant,
this is
un
for
poids budgétaire très
consumption
important. J'ai
subsidies,
juste
and this
mentionné les
represents a huge
subventions
share of the
à
budget.
l'électricité, puisqu'on n'en a pas
There's
parlé,
also subsidies
mais
for
quand même, qui
electricity,
sont
which can
substantielles.
reach
Et quand on va
4 or
dans les
5
pays
times
et qu'on
this
les
level.
estime,
And when
on
you
arrive
go to the
souvent
countries
à
to
des
assess
estimations
them,
4 à 5 fois plus importantes comme
so
dépenses
sometimes
budgétaires
4 or 5
que
times
les dépenses sur les
higher
carburants. Donc comme quoi,
than
le
subsidies for
contrôle des
fuel.
prix sur ces
So price
biens-là
regulation for these
est
goods
vraiment une dépense très très importante dans les
is
pays émergents.
represents
Et je ne reviens pas
significant
sur
expenditures in
l'ensemble des
emerging
distorsions qui
countries.
sont
And I won't come back to all the market distortions
provoquées par ces contrôles de prix.
triggered
Mario
by
les a
price
déjà mentionnées.
regulation. Mario already
Donc on
mentioned
peut passer à la
those.
slide suivante. Parce que
So here,
ce qui est intéressant quand on se met au service des États qui ont ce
when
genre de
you work
politique
at the
publique,
service of a state
qui
with this
sont
sort of
tout
public
à fait au
policy,
courant du nombre
who are
de
perfectly
distorsions
aware
qu'elles
of the
entraînent,
number of
c'est
distortions they lead
comment
to,
d'abord pourquoi elles sont là et
the
comment on peut
question is,
faire
why are
pour
they there and
les aider à
how
finalement
can they be
bifurquer et
helped
mettre en œuvre d'autres
to
politiques qui
implement
servent
other types of
les objectifs de
policies
politique publique
to
pour
serve the
sanctionner
public policy
les
objectives,
inégalités, efficience
to fight against
économique et lutte
inequality,
contre la pauvreté.
and to fight against
Souvent,
poverty.
ces contrôles de prix, ils sont là
So very
parce
often,
qu'on
price
n'a pas
regulation is
d'alternative
there because there's no
pour
alternative
mieux servir, par exemple,
to better
les
serve
populations et ou les secteurs qu'on aimerait
populations
bien
or
soutenir parce que voilà, ça fait
sectors
partie de la
that
politique
governments want to support
publique
because
que,
it's part of
que
public
les gouvernements en
policy.
place souhaitent mettre en œuvre. Je voulais mentionner ce
And I
petit
wanted
triptyque qui est extrêmement
to
important
show these
à chaque fois qu'on veut
this
essayer de
trinity.
soutenir des
Every
populations, mais ça
time
peut être aussi des secteurs
countries
économiques
want to
ou
support a given
des tailles
sector
de
or a
d'entreprises,
given
des
share
petites
of the
et très petites et
population,
moyennes
or let's
entreprises
say small
qui
and
font le
middle-sized
tissu économique de bien
enterprises, which
des économies
create the
informelles.
social fabric of many
Mais pour ça,
informal
les
economies.
gouvernements, ils
But
ont
for
besoin
that,
d'une
governments
infrastructure
need
spécifique. Et
specific
cette infrastructure, elle
infrastructure.
repose
And
sur
that
3 piliers.
infrastructure is based on 3
Un
pillars.
pilier d'identification.
An
Il est
ID
extrêmement
system,
important de connaître sa
that's
population
it's
et de
important to
connaître ses
know
secteurs
who your
pour pouvoir les
inhabitants
aider.
are and what your
S'il
sectors
n'y a
are to be
pas
able to help them. Without that information
ce système d'identification en place,
of an
c'est très
ID,
compliqué ensuite d'envoyer des soutiens et d'envoyer de
you
l'argent
can't send out support, you can't send
à
money
des gens qu'on ne connaît pas.
if you don't know who
Ensuite,
you're sending it to.
on peut vouloir cibler. C'est
And
exactement
then you can
l'exemple
also
qu'a
try
donné
to
le
target
directeur de la
specific
législation
populations.
au Tchad. Il y a certains
And
secteurs
this
qu'on a
is
envie
what
de
the
cibler, puis il
director
y a
of
certains secteurs qu'on a envie
legislation mentioned for Chad.
d'exclure
Some
du soutien du gouvernement.
sectors are
Pour ça,
supported,
il
others
faut
are
des
excluded from
moyens
government support.
de
And for that, you need a way
classer et
to
trier les
classify and
populations et ou les
sort
secteurs.
given
En
populations and
général,
sectors.
une façon de faire, c'est pour les
Generally, this is
entreprises,
done
le
for
chiffre d'affaires,
companies, for
pour
example, through revenue,
les populations, les
turnover,
foyers,
or
les
if
ménages, les
it's
familles,
people,
c'est
well,
le
it's
niveau de ressources.
households
Si on
and
n'a pas
the
d'informations
level
là-dessus,
of
c'est très compliqué
income.
de cibler.
Without that
Or,
information, it's
les
impossible
gouvernements
to
le savent bien,
target given
ils n'ont pas
populations.
forcément beaucoup d'argent à mettre, et l'argent
And there
qu'ils
isn't
mettent, ils veulent
necessarily
qu'il
a
soit
lot
le
of
plus
money
efficace possible.
available.
Donc
And
pour
of
ça,
course,
il
the
faut cibler.
money that's
Et ensuite,
available,
évidemment,
it's
il
important
faut
to use it
une
wisely. So for that,
infrastructure physique
aid has to be targeted.
qui
But then you
puisse
also
et ou
need
dématérialisée, mais en tout
physical
cas une
infrastructure and also
opérationnelle qui puisse
intangible
simplement permettre au
operational
gouvernement
infrastructure so that the
déployer
government
des
can
soutiens.
actually send out
Faute de
this
ça,
support.
eh ben,
Without this,
souvent, les contrôles par les prix
very
sont
often price
le second best,
regulation is just second
vraiment
best.
l'alternative
It's just an alternative.
à cela. Donc, on peut passer à la dernière slide.
So my last slide.
Donc, voilà, on voit, les contrôles de prix sont vraiment une
So
alternative
price
second best des
regulation
gouvernements.
is a second
Les
best
gouvernements
alternative
sont
for
conscients et sont
governments,
conscients
and governments are aware of
des
this.
distorsions.
And they're aware of
Maintenant, quand
market
on en sort,
distortions.
Mario Mansour a
And
commencé
Mario
à l'évoquer, et c'est
Mansour
effectivement
started
dans le
mentioning
chapitre
this.
2
So in
du
chapter
fiscal monitor
2
qui est sorti
of
la
the
semaine
Fiscal
dernière.
Monitor,
Je
which
vous invite à
came out last
consulter, c'est à la
week,
fin de cette présentation,
and you can have a
que
look
vous
at it at the
trouverez le
end
lien.
of the presentation. You'll find a link.
D'abord, ce qu'on voit, c'est que les réformes, elles doivent être graduelles. On ne peut
So
pas faire la révolution,
reforms
le grand
have to
soir
be
des contrôles de
gradual.
prix
You can't overhaul everything
d'un matin à l'autre, sauf,
from one day to the next.
et on a entendu
Unless, and this is something we
l'exemple
heard
du Congo,
with the
quand on
example
y
of
est appuyé,
Congo,
mais quand on
unless
y
you
est
have no
appuyé, ça fait
choice.
mal. Donc,
But when you
c'est-à-dire
have
qu'on
no
est obligé
choice,
de
then
faire
it
des
hurts.
augmentations de prix
It means you have
substantielles,
to
on en a parlé, 30%
substantially
du
increase
jour au
prices
lendemain, c'est quand même
30%
pas
from one day to
négligeable,
the
et
next.
ça a un
That's
impact
going to
direct dans les
hurt
poches des
and
consommateurs.
will have a direct impact on
Donc, ce qu'il faut, c'est plutôt
available
anticiper la
money for
réforme et
households.
la
So it's
planification
important
graduelle.
to
Et ensuite,
plan
tant
ahead.
qu'on a des contrôles de prix, ce
And
qui est
then
important,
when
c'est
you have price
de
regulation, then what's
faire
important
ces
is
contrôles de prix
to
selon un certain nombre
do
de
it
principes
in
clés.
a
Je vais en
way
donner
that
3
respects
ici,
a
je
number
pourrais y
of
revenir
key
dans les
principles. I'm just
questions
providing
sans aucun
3
problème.
here. We can
Premier
come back to
principe, c'est
these
une
during
question de
Q&A.
transparence.
So first of all,
C'est-à-dire
there
qu'il
is the
faut
principle of
voir relativement
transparency.
peu lorsque ces contrôles de prix sont mis en
This,
place.
when price
C'est qu'ils
control is
sont en
set up,
général
very
très
often
peu accompagnés d'une
they're
transparence sur ce
not
qu'ils sont
made
exactement,
transparent on
sur
what
ce
they're
qu'ils
doing
ont comme effet,
exactly, what the
et
effects are,
sur leur durée de vie.
and
Donc,
how
pour nous, c'est
long
extrêmement
they're set
important
up for.
que les gouvernements
But
soient
it's important
transparents
that
sur
governments
ces
be
contrôles de prix.
transparent around price
Un autre
regulation.
principe clé, c'est la
Another
simplicité.
key
Quand on
transparency,
contrôle les prix,
another
on le fait de
key
façon
principle
simple
is
et on ne
simplicity.
module pas
You have
l'ensemble des
to
paramètres qui
regulate
composent le prix d'un bien
prices
de façon
For the
totalement
simplest of
discrétionnaire.
reasons. And you have to do it to increase understanding.
Surtout, ça donne des opportunités de recherche de rente par
and it's important to prevent people from just trying to reduce their or to increase their rents. And then consistency is the third essential pillar for price regulation. Energy prices, fuel prices, food prices generally are volatile on international markets. It's understandable that governments want to cover some of that volatility to protect their consumers, but it's important that the prices do vary. They can't be set for months or years, because that is the case in a number of countries. So I will stop here, but we can come back, of course, to any of these elements and operational modalities for reform. Thank you.
Merci Delphine.
Thank you, Delphine.
Je retourne maintenant vers Monsieur
I'm now
𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐴
turning to Mr. 𝐭𝐫𝐴 for questions of inequality in spending and unfair subsidies.
Thanks for
Thank you, Grégoire.
The subsidies, we see most of our subsidies practices as unfair, and for one simple reason, that they further deepen the already deep inequality that we see across different countries. And therefore, at Oxfam, for example, we not advocate for example, regulating consumer prices for commodities such as energy or food. Because many subsidies are deliberately or otherwise designed to benefit, as I said, the rich, well-connected business people, or simply at the detriment of the majority poor. And we see really it across where subsidies are not necessarily translating into positive outcomes for the poor, but rather benefiting those that are actually in business. We basically instead encourage that countries provide safety nets to protect the most vulnerable and marginalized population. Because as I've been saying, current subsidy regimes, they often disproportionately benefit wealthier individuals and corporations rather than communities who are really the most needy. In many African countries, subsidies on fuel, energy, or agricultural inputs, they are benefiting high-income groups, rich businesses, simply because they consume more. So, but rural, low-income and marginalized communities receive as much smaller share of the benefits. So these, on the other hand, these subsidies, they drain public resources that could have otherwise been used to invest in essential services like education, healthcare, or social protection. And that, again, deepen further the same inequality I've been talking about. We also think that there could be some ways of improving these practices. And I think, as Delphine was talking about, one way to improve on subsidies practices is to make them targeted, especially in a way that they can tackle and reach the most vulnerable. Reform to be designed in a way that protect the most vulnerable, there should be that intention. It should be intentional, especially by governments, but also other actors, that reforms are coming up, bring about some of these practices that are, for example, targeting poor people, as mentioned in the beginning. For example, we've seen practices like cash transfers being really quite effective in that they support the most vulnerable, and we've also seen that they support the most vulnerable, and they can be funded. They can be funded through proper taxation of the wealth, and that is really what we promote. We also believe that reform processes must be transparent and inclusive, as has been said. Affected communities should be actively consulted in designing and implementing reforms, ensuring that decisions are grounded in real experience of the most needy. Of course, fairness demands addressing what we call systemic privilege. For example, reform should coincide with progressive measures, such as increasing tax on wealth. This is really at the center of our message. Increasing tax on wealth, on luxury goods, and high corporate profits, ensuring that the better off contribute their fair share. I think it has also been mentioned that it is very important that this whole process is sequenced. And for us, the sequence should be that government first strengthen and expand social safety nets before implementing some of these reforms to avoid worsening hardship or fueling social unrest and injustice. I just wanted to share a few figures just to clarify why we really insist on reforms and policies that can tackle inequality, because we believe that only reform that invests in adequate tax of the high net worth individuals and would be the most fair, especially in the context of Africa. Because when we look at Africa, Africa is one of the most unequal continents, where 6 rich people, all of them men, have more wealth than half of the region, 700 million people combined. Those 1% or 6 richest people, they own more than what 7 million people, African people, own combined. And half of the 50 most unequal countries worldwide, they are in Africa. That's why we are saying that any tax policies, any fiscal reforms should be would be only fair if they tackle this issue. We also see, for example, that since 2020, the average income of the richest 1% has increased 2.5 times faster than that of the poorest 50%. And this is all because of the fiscal policies that are not really people-centered. And that's why we believe only that fair fiscal reforms would be only those that are people-centered. We also see, for example, another data is that Africa dollar millionaire, accounting for 0.02% of the population, own near a fifth of the region's wealth, while the poorest 50 own less than 1%. Another last figure I want to share here is that in Africa, men own 3 times more wealth than women, the highest compared to other regions, and 2 times higher than the world ratio. So in short, to answer to the question about whether subsidies are fair or not, we believe current subsidy practices are not fair because they further deepen this inequality that I just described here. And we believe that they can be made fair by especially being people-centered, especially being intentional as when it comes to tackling the needs of the most vulnerable. Examples are, for example, some cash transfer programs that we've seen in a number of countries. And I also was requested to speak a bit about how, for example, the civil society could contribute in all this. And I think our role as civil society is mostly monitoring, but also we do a lot of influencing. And what we also do is to what we call to amplify citizen voice. And I think through all this, we can contribute and shape reform processes that are really progressive, that are pro-people, that are people-centered. And we've seen this happening in a number of countries. I was thinking about cases like what just happened the other time in Kenya, where people really felt that the finance bill that was coming up was going to have a huge impact on their daily life, and they spoke out. And I think those are really cases where people can push through and end up with fairer fiscal policies that would raise burden, especially the poor. And I think the influencing work, the advocacy work, but also more importantly, citizen education and amplifying citizen voice is what I think the civil society can do. And for us in Oxfam, that's what we do. We have a number of initiatives with local partners that really are working with governments, but also local populations to make sure that the local population, youth, women are involved in finance and budget discussions, and that they also interrogate how tax expenditure is being approached by governments. So I think with those efforts, we can support government institutions, especially having the local organization at the center of this to come up with more progressive tax and fiscal policies. So I think that's a bit about the position of especially Oxfam, but also in general our partners on this issue of subsidies, but also how as a civil society we can contribute to make this much more fairer, especially in a way that it speaks to the needs of the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Bien, nous arrivons à la conclusion.
Thank you so much for this contribution. We are now coming to the conclusion, the summary of this webinar and outlook, and we can answer a number of questions we have received in the chat afterwards. So in terms of first a summary, I will give the floor to Mr. 𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐭𝐨𝐫. Again, if you would like to take the floor.
Monsieur Esdras.
Or Mr. Esdras.
Bonsoir.
Thank you.
Je suis d'accord avec Monsieur Audas.
Yes, I agree with the governments and local organization looking to fund growth development. So for example, in Chad, we are examining the question of a universal health cover. So it is the subject of one of the reforms. Also, we started to implement at the time changes in excise duties, in levies, because we know that they are related to high levels of consumption. So creating a link with a universal health insurance. We know that access to basic health services can be difficult in certain areas, but if the government can subsidize this sector, there will be a high impact on state budget. So of course the government is looking to mobilize domestic revenue, and we have heard the presentations and it applies very much to our country. The aim of our administration is to improve taxation on international corporations who may not be contributing the way that they should. So international tax policies or tax policies applicable to international companies is something we are looking into to then improve resource mobilization. And so capacity building for our administration is another measure. So training our staff would help in improving resource mobilization, because resource mobilization, of course, if it is improved, can help in improving social measures, social policies, and facilitate investment. So this question of social protection, social welfare is something that can be implemented in an easier way if we improve domestic resource mobilization. So that is why we're looking to streamline, rationalize tax expenditure to restore this margin. So we have to look into drawing a parallel between, of course, tax expenditure and revenue, but we're also looking to streamline, rationalize tax expenditure to give a little bit more room for maneuver for our government to improve social protection. So I just wanted to add this following Mr. Oda's presentation. Thank you. And Mr. 𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐽𝐽, if you are here, yes, in turn, I wanted to highlight two main points. The first one being that domestic resource mobilization and subsidies rationalization are two complementary elements. That was my first point. And second point, what would be the recommendations we could give for our country? The first recommendation is to establish transparency, accountability, and implementing a rigorous evaluation of public subsidies. I think it's a first step to make all subsidy mechanisms visible and understandable. But it is also essential to make sure people and civil society organization accept and understand it, because in this area it is often not transparent enough, when this aspect is key to reach the objectives in revenue mobilization, but also in public finance consolidation. So it is a very important element, especially if we compare it with global outlooks with high levels of uncertainty, with decreasing official assistance, increasing costs on international markets. So it is important to increase domestic resource mobilization, but also keep on working on rationalizing tax expenditure and subsidies alike. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. 𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐽𝐽. Back to you, Mario Mansour, the IMF.
Merci, Grégoire.
A conclusion or summary? Well, by way of summary, I would like to give 4 messages on this topic. The first one is that subsidies can have an indirect effect on taxation overall, and this is a significant impact. Just by way of illustration, we worked recently on our global database on tax and non-tax revenue. On average, non-tax revenue represents 45% overall of state revenue, government revenue throughout the world. That is about half of the budget coming directly to non-tax tax products. So in advanced economies, we are talking about social contributions in emerging countries and low-income countries. They are often oil revenues. But then we see the tax element is increasing. So one way to analyze that is to say that these 4 or 5 main taxes collected by states are often not reformed in the best possible way to provide sufficient finance for governments. So that means subsidies, when we include them in prices, do show that they are not efficient enough or do not feed into this potential to reform taxation as a whole. Second point is dialogue with citizens, with population. We have heard about Kenya, Lebanon in 2019, for example.
L'Internet ou des subventions qui ont été retirées d'une façon brusque et
internet measures or subsidies that have been withdrawn quickly. So these measures have not borne fruit, and then they can be a setback to these measures. And so it was already mentioned by Delphine, but what should we do? Of course, we need to understand the consequences. We need to explain to citizens what the consequences or alternatives may be. What are the consequences of subsidized prices? And what should we do if these subsidies are gradually withdrawn over time? Globally, if we look at a country with a lot of subsidies, then they need to apply other taxes to finance, to fund government expenditure. And these taxes, generally speaking, are regressive taxes in certain countries. For example, they may resort to increasing VAT or applying new excise duties, but then it wouldn't make sense because taxing sugar means we are taxing sweet drinks, but we are subsidizing bread or flour, which actually also includes a lot of sugar. It is contradictory. So this message is important. Another important message is supporting low-income households, but there isn't a direct link between a low-income household and high subsidy household. We cannot tell people that indirect subsidies will support households directly because it is not true. We need to give a realistic explanation on the issue and the policies the governments are applying or want to apply to support the most disadvantaged. And in this regard, I want to say new technologies or perhaps also older technologies can be used, are used in a number of countries already to better target recipients. So it could be through credit cards, or it could be in the same way we have done it in Egypt or in Latin America. There are several ways to proceed with these measures depending on the available technology. Delphine will tell us a little bit more about this, I'm sure. So there are ways to perhaps not achieve the best possible policy ever, but at least having a less costly way to subsidize. So this is what I wanted to tell you today. Thank you, Delphine. Thank you very much. Yes, it is a summary of the summary. Perhaps I am going to share the 4 messages that were just shared. We'll turn to 2. First, the subsidies policies, depending on how they are implemented, may not be sustainable because of distortions, fundamental distortions. And as Mario just mentioned, often they only achieve, they rarely achieve the aims, the targets. So the measures implemented could be fixed subsidies for fuel, for example, for fuel in petrol stations. And I have been to a number of countries, African countries, also, and I noticed that poor people do not benefit from these fixed prices because of distortions. We see supply chains are disrupted and inefficient, and it's rationing happens, and then the most disadvantaged do not have access to fuel that they need for their small businesses. If they have access to it, they have access to, for example, fuel on the black market, and then fuel will be sold at a much higher price than that fixed price. So these subsidies are not an adequate support measure, not for the economy, nor for citizens. Another message is it can be reformed. We have seen a number of countries who have reformed the system and gradually, not overnight, but gradually, they have been able to reform their subsidies system to adjust prices in the energy sector and food products, and have been able to switch to a different system with a more targeted social protection system, which leads to improved economic and social results. So we need political will, the will to achieve different policies. And we heard about cash transfers, especially from 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐿. So we know that governments can implement targeted cash transfers. We have seen in Togo during the COVID pandemic, it can be done very quickly in order to support certain people who were previously underserved. It was done over the course of a few months. So by way of conclusion, I would say if there is a will to reform subsidies, if there is a will, there is a way. And we have heard from Chad and from the Republic of Congo, and they can, of course, tell us more about it, I am sure. Thank you. I see Paul Moreno, advisor at the French Treasury. Did you want to also join us to present a conclusion? Not now? Okay, I will look at the questions in the chat. And so there are a number of questions related to tax expenditure. Is there an optimal level of tax expenditure in relation to GDP?
Oui, alors je dirais, je veux dire, si on suit les principes d'une fiscalité neutre,
if we follow the principles of a neutral, efficient, fair taxation, financing public expenditure, a certain ratio of public expenditure, in principle, there is a level which would be 0. The ratio, ideal ratio would be 0. But then the question it raises is, if we think of certain sectors, R&D, with positive externalities, can they be supported by direct or indirect subsidies? This is one question. With certain countries with high levels of taxation, often research and development is financed by lower taxation. For example, I am thinking of the tax credit for research and development in France, aims at reducing the payroll costs in research and development, these costs, payroll charges can be quite high in this sector. So we can discuss, we can talk about these issues, but we need to ask two questions. Is it the best way to support this sector, this activity, through taxation, adjusting taxation, or a different budget? Because we are talking today about poor countries, for example, or the most vulnerable in society, then would the optimal measure really be adjusting taxes, or would direct cash transfers be more efficient? And then is it worth it? This is something to discuss with the administration. Is taxation the best way to encourage certain businesses, activities, or sectors?
Merci. J'ai une question assez
Thank you.
générale qui est arrivée tôt dans le chat.
So another
pour
general
Oxfam,
question
Monsieur 𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐵𝐚
for
et aussi,
Mr.
𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐵𝐚
and Antoine Nkodia
Pourquoi les dirigeants
and
en Afrique
𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐫𝐴
refusent de taxer
Esdras,
les
why
riches
do
en
leaders
Afrique?
in Africa refuse to tax rich people in their countries?
Je ne sais pas si j'ai une réponse, peut-être
I don't know if I have an answer,
mais je pense que
but I think
c'est aussi une question de
it's also a question
gouvernance, parce que
of governance,
ça va de pair avec la qualité de la gouvernance en place.
because it goes
Je
hand in
pense
hand
que
with governance.
aussi avec le temps, avec la gouvernance qui se fixe au niveau du continent, je pense qu'on va
And
y arriver.
then,
Mais je trouve
I
ça comme une question de gouvernance.
really, it is linked to governance.
Qui fait qu'on n'arrive pas à
And
faire. Des fois,
it's something
je
that we're
dirais
just
aussi
not
qu'il y a
able to
aussi
do.
des
And there
aspects de
may,
corruption
there's also the question of
qui fait que
corruption.
bien sûr, les plus riches sont aussi ceux
Obviously,
qui
the
possèdent le
richest are
pouvoir
also those with the
qui
with the
peuvent
most power
influencer les politiques à
to
l'extérieur.
influence policy.
Mais peut-être que Antoine peut aussi
But maybe Antoine or
Ok, merci par rapport à cette
Clarisse.
question. C'est
Yes,
pas
sir. Thank you for this question.
pas très évident, mais déjà dans notre environnement,
In our
qui est
environment,
riche et qui ne l'est pas,
who's rich and who isn't?
la question reste entière. Mais déjà, il y a deux pistes.
No, the answer isn't always
Depuis
easy.
quelques années, nous sommes en train de réfléchir sur la
So people
taxation du
have
foncier,
been
par exemple.
thinking about
Si vous observez bien dans nos
taxing real
grandes
estate,
villes,
for example. If you
dans le
look in our
pays, vous allez
cities,
observer que en termes
often you'll see
d'inégalité, vous
that
voyez que
in termes of
le foncier reste,
inequality,
en tout cas, sous-taxé. Et
land
si vous
is
regardez bien l'architecture du
undertaxed.
foncier, c'est-à-dire que c'est là où
And when you look at
apparaît
the
la question des
architecture,
riches, c'est-à-dire que qui détient en quelque
well,
sorte
who owns
l'extension
most
du
of the
foncier, par
land?
exemple.
Well,
C'est là où vous vous rendez compte que si on est les
this is
quartiers, il y
where
a quand même une différence. Donc, à ce moment, on peut se poser la question si
this
on veut
is this
réellement
might
taxer
be a
ceux
way
qui
if you
ont
really
élevé
want
et riches,
to
ça serait plus dans le
tax
foncier. Je crois
people
que
with
dans le
high
second temps,
revenues. I think then taxing
la
land
nouvelle
would be a good way to
réflexion
do
sur la
it.
politique fiscale
And now
lancée
people are thinking, well, are just starting to think about
se pose déjà. Le Cameroun a commencé récemment avec la taxation
this
des
sort of thing,
particuliers. Je crois que
and with the
les autres
taxation
pays
of
également de la
individuals.
CEMAC ont
But
vu
I
ça.
think that other countries within the
Et nous sommes en
CMAC
train
are
de réfléchir
also thinking about this. So to think
quelle
about how
taxation, en tout cas,
what
pertinente par rapport à ce secteur qui,
form of
selon moi, le plus
taxation is
efficient
most
sur la gouvernance.
pertinent.
Il fallait avoir l'adhésion, en tout cas, d'une volonté politique forte,
But
mais
it's
également
important to have
aussi la
strong
société
political
civile
will
pour
and
mener
support
ce
from
combat. Le
civil
deuxième aspect pour
society.
la taxation des riches, pour nous,
And then
c'est
also
toute la
the
question
second
donc, au niveau
aspect
international, avec déjà
is international.
des multinationales qui ne contribuent
There
pas
are
vraiment à la hauteur
multinational companies that, of course, don't
qu'elles doivent au budget de l'État et toute la problématique des
pay everything they
transferts,
should to the state
des transferts de bénéfices à l'étranger. Mais il y a
and
également
tend to transfer their
tout ce qu'on
benefits
appelle le droit
abroad.
informel. Nous avons dans nos pays,
And in our countries,
si vous regardez les données de la douane, par exemple,
if you look at customs data, for example,
ces chiffres à des milliards, mais qui ne figurent pas forcément dans les fichiers de l'administration fiscale.
you could see billions coming in, but apparently it isn't taxed. I mean, you won't find any trace of these imports within the tax administration. So those are some ways to maybe implement a consistent tax policy. And then that would be a way of taxing rich people. But of course, it's hard to map out who is rich, who has a middle income, and who has low income. But I think with those three areas, it is possible to have increased fiscal justice. Thank you. Mr. Nkodia, would you like to say a word?
Sur cette question,
Yes, on this question,
je fais mienne, effectivement,
I agree
ce qui a été dit.
with what was
Je
said.
voudrais juste ajouter deux
And I would just
choses.
like to add two
La
things.
première, c'est
First of all,
l'introduction dans mon pays,
the
on parle du
introduction
du numéro d'identification unique.
of a single ID number.
De capter à travers un identifiant
So
tous les contribuables
if all
potentiels,
potential taxpayers have an ID number, whether they be rich or poor, this is something which would at least make it possible to better understand the populations and who should be paying taxes. There's also digitalization as a way of reducing payments in cash. And then the third thing, and this would require a lot of work, my colleague from Chad mentioned it, it's important to also overhaul how people declare their revenue for physical people. Is the current method contributing to allowing the wealthiest to choose whether to declare their revenue or not?
Merci. Alors, j'ai une question pour
Thank
Delphine
you.
sur
I have a
comment
question for
peut-on mettre en
Delphine
place
on
un système fiscal
how is
juste
it
dans un
possible to
pays où une
implement
bonne
a
partie de la
fair
population est
tax
informelle.
system in countries
Bien sûr,
where
récemment
a
sur le
large
sujet.
share of the economy is
Ouais,
informal?
merci. Et puis ça vient d'être
Yes,
abordé.
thank you.
De toute
And
façon,
yes, we did just
je
mention
crois,
this
assez éloquente par
quite eloquently
le représentant
by
du Tchad et le représentant du
the
Congo.
representative of Chad and Congo.
Lutter entre guillemets contre
To
l'informel,
fight
c'est
against the informal
d'un côté, le
sector
côté recette,
means, well, first of all, there's
créer
the
des
income.
bases taxables.
You have
Ça
to
veut dire
create a
révéler aux
tax
autorités.
base.
Pour ça, il faut
That would
collecter un
mean
certain nombre
revealing all
d'informations
the
sur
information
des
to the
bases
authorities. And so
taxables
collecting
potentielles.
it from the
On l'a
tax
mentionné
bases
sur
on
le
the ground,
foncier, on l'a mentionné sur
land
le
taxes, for
chiffre d'affaires des
example,
compagnies
or
internationales
revenue of
intervenant dans
international
dans les pays.
corporations,
Les revenus des ménages les plus
revenue
pauvres pour lesquels on
from
peut
the
avoir un
poorest
certain nombre de faisceaux
households,
d'indices. Ça peut être soit effectivement le foncier,
with
mais ça peut être
information
aussi un
provided
autre type
by
de
land
possession.
registers, other types of
Dans certains
possessions.
pays,
In some
ça,
countries,
on en a discuté très longuement
we've
aussi avec
also
Grégoire. Ça
mentioned,
peut être
we
aussi
talked a lot about
d'autres
this with
petites
Grégoire.
choses. On
There can
utilise
be other
les
things,
téléphones. C'est le
telephones,
nombre passé sur les téléphones, d'heures passées
to
sur le téléphone.
see
Mais
how many
qu'est-ce
hours
qu'on peut
people
révéler
spend on
comme
their
base taxable?
phones.
Il y a à
So
la fois
how can
la
you
base
reveal your
taxable
tax
qu'on
base?
révèle
So
en
there's this
sortant de
tax base
l'informel.
that has to
Ça, il
be
faut créer
revealed.
l'information et utiliser
So you have
l'information
to
pour
create the
redistribuer là où elle est
information
produite.
and then
Il y a la
use the
douane,
information where it
l'administration
is
fiscale,
produced,
etc.
so
Et
customs,
puis, côté
tax
dépenses, il y a
administration,
tout
etc.
ce
And
qu'on
then
a
for spending, for
une base de la base
expenditure,
taxable et des recettes.
once you know what
Qu'est-ce
the
qu'on en
tax
fait?
base
Il faut
is
créer une
and what the
base de
revenues
dépenses,
are,
une
then you
base
have to create a base for
de
expenditures
secteurs ou de populations
with
et de
the
foyers
sectors
pour lesquels
or
on
types of
souhaite
households
mettre en place des services publics. Ces services publics, c'est
that the
évidemment
government
en
wants to set up
priorité
public services
l'éducation et la
for,
santé,
of
et
course,
puis les
education
systèmes
and
de
healthcare,
protection sociale.
but
Donc,
also a social
l'informel,
safety net.
ça empêche de mettre
So the
d'avoir des
informal
bases taxables
sector
et ça empêche
makes it
d'avoir des
impossible to
bases
have
de
a tax
dépenses.
base and therefore
Sur
an
les bases de dépenses,
expenditure
il
base.
y a
to have an expenditure base, well, it's exactly what Mr. 𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐭𝐨𝐵 said from Congo. There's the fact of setting up ID systems. So everybody has a single ID. So you have a number with your national ID card, and then you are known to state services. And then you can connect to a number of things, get information on the resources for each household, information around what work they do, where they work. Is it the formal, the informal sector? How many hours worked? So this is information that can be gathered. But the topic here is how to make it acceptable, make people willing to reveal this information. And here, I think it's just like when you're thinking about reforming subsidies for energy, for example. The government has to request information, and this is private information that individuals won't necessarily want to share with authorities, and often because they don't trust their governments. So the governments have to prove at the same time that there will be services supplied in exchange. So there needs to be simplification of assistance provided for taxpayers. So they know, okay, if they've paid their taxes, then nobody else will be asking for money. There won't be some X agency or Y agency. The gentleman from Chad said that there are agencies who had powers to exonerate people from taxes, okay, saying, okay, you don't have to pay, you have to pay. But taxpayers want to know that, okay, I've revealed my information to the government, and now I paid my taxes, and that requires a certain behavior on the part of governments as well. So you have to have a proof of concept that by revealing the information and coming out of the informal sector, this will have a beneficial impact. And this is up to governments to prove. Thank you very much. Thank you, Delphine. Okay, we have come to the end of our meeting. We're even a little bit behind. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for their participation and the 130 people who attended online. Thank you very much. And our webinar is now over. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Merci.
Au
Merci à
revoir,
vous.
merci. Au revoir.